If you close one eye right now,
Mm-hmm.
catching a baseball suddenly becomes,
Yeah.
just a little bit trickier.
Right, because you lose that sharp depth perception.
Exactly. But, I mean, your brain is incredibly adaptable, right?
Yeah.
Within a few seconds, you figure out how to compensate.
Yeah, you start using shadows or the relative size of the ball.
Yeah. You could probably still catch it without embarrassing yourself too much. But okay, put yourself in a totally different scenario.
All right.
You're sitting in a packed, incredibly noisy restaurant. Dishes are clinking. There's a dozen different conversations happening at once. Loud music is pulsing overhead.
An absolute acoustic nightmare.
Totally. Now, if you were to plug just one ear in that specific room, the entire acoustic landscape completely collapses.
It just turns into mud.
Yes. It instantly turns into a wall of muddy, indistinguishable noise. You can't just adapt to it like you do with your eye. You suddenly lose the ability to understand the person sitting directly across the table from you.
It is a phenomenal, almost like jarring shift in perception.
It really is.
There's actually this quote from the philosopher Immanuel Kant that perfectly captures this specific human experience and the isolation that comes with it.
Oh, yeah. What did he say?
He wrote, "Blindness separates us from things, but deafness separates us from people."
Wow. That is heavy.
It is, yeah.
But it gets right to the heart of what we're doing today for this deep dive. Because we are exploring the ultimate biological supercomputer, which is human hearing. Specifically, binaural hearing.
Having 2 ears.
Right. What exactly happens when we use 2 ears to process the world? Because, I mean, we completely take for granted that we just automatically know someone is walking up behind us.
Or that we can just effortlessly tune out a loud room to hear a whisper.
Exactly. So we're going to dig deep into the raw physics and the biology of how we process sound. And then we're going to look at the massive hurdles modern engineers face when they try to, teach machines to hear the way that you and I do.
And that transition from biology to engineering is where things get incredibly complicated.
Oh, I bet. And I should mention, the source material we're working from today is incredible. It's the foundational textbook, The Technology of Binaural Listening, edited by Jens Blauert.
It's basically the Bible for this stuff.
It really is. And specifically, we're looking at the collaborative work of the AABBA group, which is this network of 15 top research labs across Europe and the U.S.
So we are dealing with the absolute cutting edge here.
Absolutely. So set the stage for us. From a purely engineering standpoint, how do scientists even look at a human head?
Well, it's kind of funny because to an engineer, the human head is essentially just an antenna holder.
An antenna holder. That's slightly insulting.
Right. But physically, you have this solid ellipsoid object, your head, and it has 2 input ports positioned at equal heights on either side.
The ears.
The ears. And this antenna holder can move about with 6 degrees of freedom. You can pitch, yaw, roll, and move forward, backward, side to side.
Okay, that makes sense.
And every single tiny movement of your head changes the acoustic data hitting those 2 input ports. Your brain is constantly processing that dynamically shifting data to build a flawless 3D map of your surroundings in real time.
Okay, I want to stop you right there because when we talk about the input ports being our ears, we're specifically talking about air conduction, right? Sounds traveling through the air.
Yes, air conduction is the primary mechanism.
But what about bone conduction? If my head is an antenna holder, isn't the skull itself picking up vibrations? I mean, I know bone conduction headphones are a huge thing right now.
They are, and bone conduction absolutely exists. The bones in your skull do transmit acoustic vibrations directly to your inner ear.
So the brain is processing that too.
It is, but when we're talking about localizing external sounds in your environment, bone conduction is virtually irrelevant compared to air conduction.
Really? Why is that?
Because the physical structure of the human skull attenuates, meaning it reduces the force of incoming sound waves by about 60 decibels compared to the sound waves entering your ear canals.
Okay, so 60 decibels. That doesn't sound like a massive number when we're just casually throwing numbers around. What does that actually mean in terms of power?
Well, the decibel scale is logarithmic, so a 60 decibel difference represents a massive power ratio of 1 million to 1.
Wait. 1 million to 1?
Exactly.
Are you serious?
Yeah. The acoustic energy reaching your inner ear through the air is 1 million times more powerful than the energy vibrating through your skull.
That is wild.
So while bone conduction is fascinating, and it's actually a big part of why your own voice sounds completely different to you than it does on a recording.
Oh, because I'm hearing my skull vibrate when I speak.
Exactly. But when it comes to hearing the world around us, the air conduction via your 2 ears is the absolute star of the show. We essentially ignore the skull vibrations in auditory modeling because the air conduction is so profoundly dominant.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have these two highly sensitive air input ports. Before we even begin to look at how we build a machine to mimic this, we need to understand the sheer performance advantage of binaural hearing, having two ears over monaural hearing, just having one.
Right, the why before the how.
Exactly. And the most obvious advantage seems to be knowing where a sound is coming from. The technical term I've seen in the sources is that two ears reduce spatial blur.
Blur is a very accurate way to visualize it. When you listen to the world binaurally, the auditory events you perceive are highly focused. They're pinpointed.
How pinpointed are we talking?
For sounds coming directly from the front of you, human beings can distinguish separate sound sources that are a mere 1 degree apart in azimuth.
Azimuth just means left to right positioning, right?
Correct. Left to right on the horizontal plane.
1 degree is incredibly small.
It is. Think about holding your arms straight out in front of you and pointing your index finger. 1 degree is roughly the width of your finger. You can tell if a sound comes from the left side of your finger or the right side.
That is incredibly precise.
It is, but if you plug one ear and try to do the exact same thing monoraurally, that localization becomes at least 10 times blurrier.
10 times. So my cone of uncertainty goes from 1 finger width to like 2 whole hands.
At least, yeah.
Yeah.
Your ability to pinpoint the sound drops dramatically. The precision just vanishes, and you start guessing within a much wider cone.
Okay, 2 points of reference give you a trigonometric fix on the target. I get that. But what happens when we move indoors?
Ah, now we're introducing the room.
Right, because if I'm standing in a normal room and you clap your hands, the sound doesn't just travel in a straight line from your hands to my ears.
No, it bounces everywhere.
Exactly. It hits me, sure, but it also travels past me, bounces off the back wall, hits the ceiling, ricochets off the hardwood floor, and hits my ears again and again and again.
It's an acoustic mess.
Right. So if my ears are so incredibly sensitive that they can detect a 1 degree shift in a sound's origin, why doesn't my brain register all those ricochets? Why don't we just go completely crazy from the echoes every time we walk indoors?
This is one of the most elegant, almost magical tricks of the human auditory system. It's a biological phenomenon known as the precedence effect.
The precedence effect. I think I've also heard it called the rule of the first wavefront.
Yes, exactly. The first wave front.
Meaning the very first ripple of sound that physically reaches my head.
Precisely. When a sound is generated in a room, your ears receive the direct, unbounced sound first because it took the shortest path.
Right, straight line.
Then, milliseconds later, they are bombarded by multiple reflections bouncing off all the surfaces. But you don't perceive a dozen distinct clapping sounds coming from the walls and the floor.
No, I just hear one clap.
Exactly. Your brain subconsciously applies what we call localization dominance. It actively fuses all of those incoming reflections into a single, cohesive auditory event.
And it assigns the location to that first straight line sound.
Yes, it assigns the location of that entire event to the origin of the very first wavefront that hit your ears.
Wait, so my brain is actively suppressing the spatial data of the echoes?
It is fusing the information, yes. And the timing of those echoes is the critical factor here. Your brain handles reflections entirely differently depending on exactly how late they arrive.
Okay, let's break down the timing. What happens first?
Well, let's say a reflection hits your ears within just 1 millisecond of the direct sound.
That's incredibly fast.
Extremely fast. In that tiny window, your brain does something called summing localization. It blends the direct sound and the reflection together so perfectly that you perceive a single sound coming from a location somewhere between the two sources.
Wait, I know this. This is how stereo speakers work, right?
Yes, you nailed it.
Like if I sit dead center between 2 speakers in my living room and they play the exact same vocal track at the exact same time, I don't hear a voice on my left and a voice on my right. I hear a phantom singer standing right in front of my TV.
That is summing localization in action. Your brain is being deliberately tricked by that 1 millisecond rule into placing the auditory event exactly halfway between the two wavefronts.
That is so cool. So what happens if the reflection arrives a little bit later?
Say between 1 millisecond and what we call the echo threshold. In this window, your brain still completely fuses the sound, so you only hear one event, but the direct sound completely dominates the perceived location.
So the phantom center effect disappears.
Right, it disappears, and you locate the sound strictly at the source of the first wavefront.
How long is this echo threshold window? Like, when does my brain finally give up and admit that it's hearing a second distinct sound?
It varies wildly depending on the type of sound you're listening to.
Really? Like what?
For a very sharp, transient sound, like a snare drum hit or a click, the threshold is very short, maybe just 1 or 2 milliseconds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so if a reflection of a click arrives 5 milliseconds later, you'll clearly hear two distinct clicks.
But it's different for other sounds.
Very different. For something flowing and continuous, like a symphony orchestra playing classical music, the threshold can stretch incredibly long, sometimes up to 80 milliseconds.
80 milliseconds is a massive window in terms of acoustic processing.
Yeah.
Why does my brain wait so long to separate the sounds from music?
Because your brain uses those leet reflections to gather data about your environment. It fuses all those overlapping reflections not to confuse you about where the orchestra is sitting.
Because I still know the violins are in front of me.
Exactly. It uses the bouncing waves to give the music a sense of richness, warmth, and physical space. This is what we call reverberance. Your brain is essentially using the reflections to calculate the physical volume of the concert hall.
That is mind-blowing. And what if the reflection takes longer than 80 milliseconds to arrive? Say I'm like shouting across a massive canyon.
Then the fusion mechanism entirely breaks down. Your brain realizes the delay is simply too great to be part of the original event, and you hear a distinct, separate, delayed echo.
Hello, hello, hello.
Exactly.
That is fascinating. So having two ears isn't just about figuring out left from right. It is a built-in audio cleanup crew.
It's an incredibly powerful processor.
I read in the textbook that researchers refer to this cleanup process as binaural dereverberation and decoloration, which sounds super technical. What does decoloration mean? How does a sound become colored in the first place?
To understand that, we have to look at the physics of sound waves bouncing around a room. When an original sound wave and its delayed reflection cross paths in the air, they interfere with each other.
Like ripples in a pond colliding.
Yes, perfect analogy. Sometimes the high-pressure peak of the first wave lines up perfectly with the high-pressure peak of the reflection. When they add together, they make that specific frequency much louder.
Okay, so it artificially boosts certain pitches.
Right, but sometimes the peak of one wave lines up with the low-pressure valley of the other. When that happens, they cancel each other out entirely.
They just delete each other.
Yeah, that frequency simply drops out of existence. This creates what acoustic engineers call a comb filter effect.
Comb filter. Like a hair comb.
Exactly like that. Because if you look at the frequency graph, it looks like the teeth of a comb. You see these huge spikes of volume followed by deep valleys of silence across the acoustic spectrum.
Oh, I see.
If you only had one ear, every sound you heard in a normal room would sound incredibly colored. It would sound artificial, teeny, and muddy because certain frequencies are being artificially boosted while others are being deleted by the room's interference.
But I don't hear the room that way. Voices just sound normal to me when I'm indoors.
Because you have two ears separated by several inches, the comb filter effect, those specific peaks and valleys, is highly dependent on the exact physical point in space where you are measuring the sound.
Okay, wait, I think I'm getting this. Because my ears are spaced apart, the interference pattern happening at my left ear is mathematically different than the interference pattern happening at my right ear.
Yes, the peak in your left ear might actually be a valley in your right ear.
Oh.
Your brain receives both of these heavily distorted, colored signals, and it seamlessly averages them together. It fills in the valleys of one ear with the peaks of the other, smoothing out the entire frequency response so the sound remains natural, clear, and uncolored.
That perfectly explains why amateur audio recordings always sound so much worse than actually being in the room.
It really does.
Like if I put my phone down on a table to record a meeting, the phone's microphone only has one ear. It captures all the raw cone filtering, all the mud, and the canceled frequencies. But if I'm sitting right next to the phone, my brain is actively filtering all of that out in real time.
You're doing real-time audio mastering in your head.
Which leads me directly back to my restaurant scenario, the famous cocktail party effect.
Ah, yeah. That's the classic example.
If I plug one ear, the restaurant sounds like a muddy wall of chaos. With two ears, I can literally zoom in on my friend's voice, even if the clinking dishes and the music are technically at a higher decibel level than their voice. How is that physically possible? And, how do scientists actually measure that advantage?
It is one of the most rigorously studied phenomena in acoustics, honestly. And we measure it using metrics like the binaural intelligibility level difference, or BILD, and the binaural masking level difference, or BMLD.
Let's avoid the alphabet soup for a second. How do you set up a physical experiment to test this zooming in effect?
Okay, imagine you're sitting in a laboratory wearing a pair of high-quality headphones. I play a loud, continuous blast of static noise into both of your ears at the exact same volume.
Like white noise.
Exactly. Then, hidden inside that static noise, I play a recording of someone reading a list of words. Initially, I play the voice so quietly that it is completely masked by the static. You can't hear a single word, you just hear the noise.
Okay, the signal is totally buried in the noise.
Right. Now, without changing the volume of the noise and without changing the volume of the voice, so no levels have changed, I do one purely mathematical thing. I flip the phase of the voice recording by 180 degrees in your left ear.
Okay, let me make sure I understand what flipping the phase physically means. Sound is just a wave of pressure, right? So if the voice wave is hitting its high-pressure peak in my right ear, it is simultaneously hitting its lowest pressure valley in my left ear.
That is exactly what it means. It is the exact same sound, just mathematically inverted in one ear.
Okay, so what happens?
When researchers do this, the result is astonishing. The hidden voice suddenly leaps out of the background noise. It becomes entirely intelligible, and you can understand the words clearly, even though the sheer volume of the noise and the voice have not changed by a single decibel.
Wait, why does my brain care if the wave is inverted?
Because your brain uses that phase difference to segregate the auditory streams. When the background noise hits both ears in perfect phase, your brain perceives it as a single block of sound located dead center in your head.
Right.
But when the target voice is inverted, when it's 180 degrees out of phase, your brain instantly recognizes it as a completely separate physical entity from the noise. It isolates the signal from the noise floor.
That is basically a superpower.
It really is. This gives listeners an actual measurable gain in speech intelligibility. It sometimes acts as if the voice was magically turned up by up to 8 decibels, which is a massive transformative advantage in a chaotic acoustic environment like your restaurant.
It's like having active noise cancellation built into our biology. So, okay, we've established the what. We know what our hearing accomplishes. It reduces spatial blur, it intelligently fuses echoes, it averages out comb filtering, and it isolates voices in a crowded room.
Right, the performance is incredible.
Now we need to transition into the how. We have to look under the hood at the squishy biological hardware that makes this possible. Because, as the researchers in the textbook constantly stress, if we want to teach a computer to do this, we have to understand the biological blueprints.
And the biological blueprints are staggering. I mean, the journey of a sound wave through the human body involves acoustic physics, mechanical engineering, and fluid dynamics before it even becomes an electrical signal.
It's a whole factory in there. So it starts obviously at the outer ear, right?
Right.
The folds of cartilage on the side of your head known as the pinna.
Yes, the pinna. And these are not just funnels shaped to collect sound like a satellite dish. They are highly asymmetrical physical filters.
What do you mean by filters?
The unique ridges and valleys of your ear cartilage physically shape and distort incoming sound waves, depending on the precise angle the sound hits them.
Okay, we'll definitely come back to the ear folds later, because I know they're crucial for figuring out if a sound is above or below you.
Yeah.
But for now, the wave goes past the cartilage, travels down the ear canal, and strikes the tympanic membrane, the eardrum.
Yes. And directly behind the eardrum is the middle ear, which houses the 3 smallest bones in the human body: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes.
Often called the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, right?
Exactly. Now, most people learn about these bones in elementary school science class, but what they rarely teach is the sheer mechanical genius of their function. They act as an impedance matcher.
Okay, what does impedance matching mean in this context?
Think about standing on the edge of a swimming pool and trying to shout to a friend who is entirely underwater.
They won't hear much of anything.
Right, why not?
Because most of the sound just bounces right off the surface of the water, doesn't it?
Exactly. That is because air has very low acoustic impedance. It's thin and it's easy to move. While water has incredibly high acoustic impedance, it's heavy and resists movement. Sound waves traveling through thin air will almost entirely reflect off the dense surface of a fluid rather than transferring their energy into it.
Okay, so how does that relate to the ear?
Well, the inner ear, the cochlea, where the auditory nerves actually live, is completely filled with dense fluid. If the sound waves vibrating your eardrum were to hit that fluid directly, 99.9% of the sound energy would just bounce off and be lost.
So the 3 tiny bones are the bridge.
They are a mechanical lever system. They take the large, low-force vibrations of the eardrum, which is being moved by thin air, and they concentrate all of that energy into small, high-force vibrations at the oval window of the cochlea.
They act like a piston.
Exactly. They physically overcome the impedance mismatch, ensuring that the acoustic energy transfers efficiently from the air outside your head into the fluid inside your inner ear.
That is brilliant. Okay, so the bones push the sound into the fluid of the cochlea, which is this tightly coiled, snail-shaped organ. What happens once the fluid actually starts moving?
Inside the cochlea, running along its entire length, is a structure called the basilar membrane. Sitting on top of this membrane are roughly 3,500 incredibly sensitive structures called inner hair cells.
Just the 3,500. That doesn't seem like a lot.
It's enough because the basilar membrane is not uniform. It actually changes in stiffness and width from one end to the other. Because of this, it's organized by a principle called tonotopy.
Tonotopy, meaning tone mapping.
Mm.
So specific frequencies map to specific physical locations on the membrane, right? Like the keys on a piano.
Precisely like a piano. The base of the cochlea, where it is stiff and narrow, resonates when exposed to high-frequency sounds. The apex of the cochlea, where it is wider and more flexible, resonates to low-frequency sounds.
Okay, so it physically separates the pitches.
Yes. When a specific frequency enters the fluid, it creates a traveling wave that peaks at a very specific physical spot on the membrane. The inner air cells at that exact spot are sheared by the movement, which opens their ion channels, and they fire an electrical spike into the auditory nerve.
That seems straightforward enough.
Oh.
It's basically a physical spectrum analyzer. But the literature suggests that how these nerves actually fire is where the biological engineering gets incredibly complicated. They don't just fire a generic on signal when they vibrate, do they?
No, they don't. And this is vital for understanding how we calculate those microsecond time differences we talked about earlier. At lower frequencies, the neural firing of the inner hair cells actually phase locks to the incoming sound wave.
Phase locking, meaning the nerve is firing in perfect synchronization with the physical rhythm of the sound wave itself.
Yes. Think of a sound wave as a series of pressure peaks and valleys. When the sound wave hits its absolute peak, the hair cell fires an electrical spike. Peak, spike, peak, spike.
So the timing of the electrical spikes perfectly matches the physical frequency of the sound.
Exactly. This phase-locked timing is the raw data the brain uses to compare the microsecond delays between the left and right ear.
I was actually trying to picture this physically while reading the research, and I came up with this analogy.
Let's hear it.
Think of those inner hair cells, like a surfer sitting out in the ocean trying to catch waves. If the waves are slow, meaning a low-frequency sound, the surfer can easily paddle and ride every single peak perfectly. They are phase-locked to the ocean.
I like that.
But biological systems have speed limits, don't they? A nerve can't fire infinitely fast.
It cannot. Every nerve in the human body has what is called a refractory period. After a nerve cell fires its electrical spike, it needs a tiny fraction of a millisecond to chemically reset itself before it can physically fire again.
Right.
Because of this obligatory reset time, phase locking starts to break down as the frequencies get higher. The cutoff point is generally between 800 hertz and 2,000 hertz.
So back to the surfer. If the waves start coming in at 2,000 times a second, the surfer simply can't catch every peak. They are totally exhausted, trying to reset. So what does the biological surfer do?
They stop trying to catch the micro peaks and they just ride the overall swell.
Right.
In acoustic terms, for high frequencies, the auditory nerve stops transmitting the fine structure of the wave, and instead it transmits the envelope of the sound.
The envelope.
Yes, the envelope is simply the overall shape of the amplitude, how the volume rises and falls over time, rather than the individual ultra-fast vibrations.
The envelope versus the fine structure, that distinction feels like it's going to be incredibly important when we talk about how algorithms process different frequencies.
Oh, it absolutely is.
So we have these electrical signals, phase-locked for low frequencies, envelope tracking for high frequencies, traveling up the auditory nerve. Where do they go? Because up until this point, the left ear and the right ear have been completely isolated systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where do they finally meet?
The signals travel up the brainstem and converge at a structure called the superior olivary complex. This is the first station in the brain where the data from the left ear and the data from the right ear physically interact.
Okay.
And it's highly specialized. It's actually divided into two distinct processing centers.
Okay, let's break them down.
You have the lateral superior olive, or the LSO. The LSO specializes almost entirely in processing volume differences between the two ears.
The LSO does volume. Got it.
Then you have the medial superior olive, the MSO, which is dedicated to processing the tiny time and phase differences between the ears.
Okay, so they split the workload.
Yes. And after the superior olivary complex does its initial math, the integrated signal moves further up the pathway to the inferior colliculus, or the IC.
And the inferior colliculus is where things get really weird, right?
Right.
I read that the IC might not just be an audio processor, it might be integrating oral inputs with visual inputs.
Yes. The IC is considered a multisensory integration hub. It is taking the three-dimensional audio map built by the lower brainstem and overlaying it with the visual map coming from your eyes. It is ensuring that what you hear matches what you see.
So my brain is actively cross-referencing my senses before I'm even consciously aware I've heard anything.
Exactly. And that brings up a crucial concept called top-down processing. Up until now, we've only discussed bottom-up processing sound physically hitting the ear, vibrating the bones, firing the nerves, and traveling up to the brain.
Right, a one-way street.
But human hearing is not just a passive microphone receiving data. The brain actively sends neural signals back down to the cochlea, literally altering the physical tension of the outer hair cells to tune them to specific frequencies based on what you are paying attention to.
Wait, my brain can physically alter the tension of my inner ear based on what I want to listen to. Like it physically changes the hardware.
Yes. Your expectations, your visual input, and your attention actually change the mechanical properties of your ear in real time.
That is insane.
It is. This top-down control is a massive frontier in acoustic science. Because while engineers have gotten very good at modeling the passive bottom-up microphone of the ear, modeling a system that dynamically retunes itself based on psychological attention is incredibly difficult for machine learning experts.
I can only imagine trying to code psychology. Okay, this feels like the perfect time to pivot to the actual math. We have our biological map. We know the ear splits high and low frequencies. We know the brainstem has the LSO looking at volume and the MSO looking at timing.
Right.
If I am an acoustic engineer in a laboratory trying to build a robot that can track a sound in a room, how do I translate that squishy, wet biology into cold, hard code?
Well, you start by isolating the interoral cues we just discussed. In the world of auditory algorithms, these are mathematically defined as interoral time differences, or ITDs, and interoral level differences, or ILDs.
Okay, ITDs for time, ILDs for level or volume.
Exactly. And to understand how mathematical models utilize these two distinct cues, we actually have to go all the way back to the year 1907 and look at Lord Rayleigh's duplex theory.
1907. So scientists were figuring out the math of 3D audio before the First World War.
They were. Lord Rayleigh was a brilliant physicist, and he postulated that human hearing must rely on two separate mechanisms. A duplex theory based purely on the physical size of sound waves.
How does the size of the wave matter?
He realized that the brain must use ILDs, the volume differences, primarily for high-frequency sounds.
Why only high frequencies? If a sound is on my left, shouldn't it always be louder in my left ear, regardless of the pitch?
It seems like it should, but you have to look at the physical dimensions of the waves. High-frequency sound waves have very short wavelengths. A 10,000 hertz tone has a wavelength of roughly 1 inch.
Okay, 1 inch.
The human head is about 6 to 8 inches wide. When a 1-inch wave coming from your left hits the left side of your solid, dense skull, the wave is physically blocked. It cannot pass through the bone, and it is too short to bend around it effectively.
It just hits a wall.
Exactly. This creates a massive acoustic shadow on the right side of your head. The right ear is sitting in that shadow, so the volume it receives is drastically lower. The brain easily detects that massive drop in volume and knows the sound is on the left.
But low frequencies are physically larger.
Vastly larger. A 50 hertz bass tone has a wavelength of over 20 feet.
Wow, 20 feet.
Yeah. So when a 20-foot wave hits an 8-inch human head, the wave doesn't even notice the head is there. It just wraps completely around the skull through a process called diffraction without losing virtually any energy.
So it just bends right around you.
Right. And because it wraps around so perfectly, there is almost zero acoustic shadow. The volume of the deep bass tone is basically identical in both the left ear and the right ear.
If the volume is identical, how does the brain know where the bass is coming from?
That is the second half of the duplex theory. For those massive low-frequency waves, the brain abandons volume entirely and relies solely on ITD's interoral time differences. Even though the volume is the same, the wave still physically arrived at the left ear a few hundred microseconds before it wrapped around to the right ear.
Okay, so Rayleigh laid down the physics. High frequency equals acoustic shadows and volume differences. Low frequency equals wave wrapping and time differences.
That's the duplex theory in a nutshell.
But observing the physics is one thing. How did scientists figure out how the brain actually calculates a difference of a few hundred microseconds? You can't just look at a brainstem with a microscope and see a stopwatch.
No, you definitely can't. The foundational theoretical breakthrough for how the brain calculates time came in 1948, proposed by a scientist named Lloyd Jeffress. The Jeffress model is arguably the most famous model in auditory processing.
What did Jeffress propose?
He proposed a theoretical neural circuit that was so elegant it completely revolutionized the field. He imagined a system of parallel neural pathways acting as delay lines.
Okay, break down the delay lines for me. Let's visualize this.
Imagine a neural axon carrying the phase-locked signal from your left ear. This axon travels horizontally across your brainstem from left to right. Now imagine another axon carrying the signal from your right ear, traveling in the exact opposite direction from right to left. They are running parallel to each other.
I picture it like two trains on parallel tracks heading toward each other from opposite sides of the country.
That is a perfect visualization. Now, positioned at regular intervals along the space between these two tracks are a series of highly specialized neurons called coincidence cells.
Coincidence cells.
Yes. A coincidence cell has a very strict rule. It will only fire an electrical pulse if it receives a signal from the left train and the right train at the exact same fraction of a millisecond. If one signal arrives even a microsecond too early, the cell ignores it.
It requires perfect coincidence.
Yes. Now, let's see what happens when a sound comes from your far left. The sound wave enters your left ear early, the left auditory nerve fires, and the left train starts traveling down the track. Because the sound hasn't reached your right ear yet, the right train is stuck at the station. By the time the sound finally reaches your right ear and the right train starts moving, the left train has already traveled far down the track, deep into the right side of the brain.
Oh, I see. Because the left train had a massive head start, they aren't going to meet in the middle. They're going to crash into each other on the far right side of the tracks.
Precisely. They will arrive at a coincidence cell located on the far right side of the neural array. The brain doesn't have to do any complex math. It just looks at which specific coincidence cell fired.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because cell number 45 fired, the brain instantly knows that the left signal had a 600 microsecond head start, which mathematically means the sound is located 60 degrees to the left. The brain translates a physical location in space into a physical location on a neural circuit.
That is unbelievably elegant. Just a physical track of delay lines? I can see why engineers would love that. It's practically a circuit board diagram waiting to be coded.
Oh, it's a programmer's dream.
But I have to bring up a huge curveball from the source material. It's titled The Mammalian Plot Twist. What happened to the Jeffress model?
What happened was one of the most significant paradigm shifts in modern auditory biology. For decades, the Jeffress model was the absolute gold standard for algorithms. And it wasn't just theoretical. Researchers definitively proved that this exact array of delay lines and coincidence cells physically exists in the brains of barn owls.
Owls, okay.
Yes, owls use this exact system to hunt mice in the dark, so everyone assumed human brains worked exactly the same way. But in 2001, researchers named McAlpine and Ruth published a paper that shocked the acoustics community. They discovered that mammals, specifically the gerbils and guinea pigs they were studying, do not use the Jeffress model.
Wait, if gerbils don't use it, that heavily implies that mammals in general, including humans, don't use it either.
Exactly. McAlpine and Groth found that instead of having a massive, detailed array of coincidence cells perfectly tuned to every possible microsecond of delay, mammalian ITD cells seem to be heavily concentrated into just two broad channels.
Two broad channels.
Yes. They found peak tuning primarily at positive and negative 45 degrees of phase difference. Mammals don't seem to have a highly granular map of specific delay times. Instead, they have two broad hemispheric channels evaluating the overall phase of the wave and comparing the relative activity between the left channel and the right channel.
Okay, I have to challenge this from an engineering perspective. I get why biologists care about the difference between an owl brain and a gerbil brain. But if I am a software engineer trying to write a localization algorithm for a virtual reality headset, does it really matter to my code if it mimics an owl or a gerbil as long as it successfully locates the audio source?
It's a fantastic question, and it highlights a profound philosophical tension within acoustic engineering. From a purely functional, pragmatic standpoint, and it often doesn't matter.
Right.
If you look at the math for lower frequency bands, the cross-correlation functions of both models yield sinusoidal curves. The outputs of an owl-based Jeffress algorithm and a gerbil-based hemispheric algorithm end up being remarkably similar in predicting the location of a sound source.
So why bother rewriting the code?
Because it depends entirely on what your ultimate goal is. Are you trying to build a machine that simply works, or are you trying to build a machine that accurately mimics human perception?
Ah, I see the distinction.
If you want to build a system that hears perfectly, use the owl. But if you want to build a system that mimics human errors, human illusions, and human limitations, which you absolutely need to do if you are testing hearing aids or evaluating how humans will perceive a 3D audio mix, then understanding the actual messy mammalian biological mechanism becomes vital.
That distinction makes perfect sense. Building a perfect ear versus building a human ear. Now, before we move on to how the real world messes all this up, we only covered the ITDs, the time differences. How are the volume differences, the ILDs, modeled mathematically?
For ILDs, algorithms generally look at what are called EI cells, or excitation inhibition cells.
Excitation and inhibition.
Yes. The mathematical modeling here often relies on formulas proposed by researchers like Reed and Bloom. In their model, an EI cell is a neuron that receives an excitatory signal, a signal telling it to fire from one ear, and an inhibitory signal, a signal telling it to shut down from the other ear.
So the two ears are literally fighting for control of the cell.
Exactly. The cell's response is mathematically tuned to peak at a very specific volume difference between the ears. If the actual volume difference of the incoming sound perfectly matches what the cell is tuned for, it fires maximally.
But what if it's slightly off?
The formula dictates that the cell's response is exponentially reduced the further the real-world volume difference is from the cell's preferred tuning. By looking at the firing rates across a population of these EI cells, the algorithm can precisely determine the volume difference and locate the sound.
Okay, I think I have a handle on the basic math. We have coincidence cells or hemispheric channels measuring time and excitation inhibition cells measuring volume. But all of this feels very sterile.
It's very lab-controlled.
Right. This is a single beep happening in a perfectly silent, echoless laboratory. The listener's real world is infinitely more chaotic. We have overlapping sounds, we have echoes, and we have sounds coming directly from the front or back, where both ears receive the exact same data. How do these pristine algorithms handle the messiness of reality?
The first major hurdle the algorithms have to overcome is something called Q trading. In a perfect laboratory, the time difference, the ITD, and the volume difference, the ILD, always agree. But in the real world, your interaural cues constantly conflict.
Give me an example of how they conflict.
Imagine you were sitting in a room, and a complex sound reflects off an oddly shaped piece of furniture. Because of the way the sound waves scattered, the low-frequency time difference tells your brain the sound is 10 degrees to your left. But the high-frequency acoustic shadow tells your brain the sound is 5 degrees to your right.
The cues are totally contradictory. It's like looking at two different GPS apps on your dashboard. Google Maps says turn left, Apple Maps says turn right. What does the algorithm do?
It has to make a compromise. Researchers Stern and Colburn developed a position variable model to explain how the brain handles this. When the cues conflict, the algorithm doesn't just randomly pick one. It calculates a centroid, essentially a weighted average of the conflicting data, and the brain places the perceived auditory event right in the middle, compromising between the two cues.
Let me push back on that because a simple average seems too basic. Does it literally just cut the difference down the middle, or does it weigh one cue more heavily than the other? Like, if I know one of my GPS apps is terrible at finding rural roads, I trust the other one more. Does the brain trust time more than volume?
That is exactly where the math gets complicated, because the brain absolutely applies weights. The weighting depends heavily on the frequency of the sound and the reliability of the cue.
Give me an example.
If the sound is heavily dominated by low frequencies, the algorithm mathematically applies a much higher weight to the time difference and largely ignores the contradictory volume difference. Furthermore, the brain seems to evaluate the coherence of the signal.
Coherent.
If the ITD is fluctuating wildly, but the ILD is steady, the brain dynamically shifts the weight to trust the steady cue. It is constantly adjusting its trust based on real-time statistical analysis of the incoming data.
Our subconscious is doing real-time statistical regression just to figure out where a sound bounced from. That is insane.
It's constantly doing math.
Speaking of bouncing, We talked earlier about the precedence effect, the brain's ability to ignore echoes and focus on the first wavefront. How do you actually program a machine to ignore room reflections?
There are a few different approaches in the literature. One common method is modeling what we call onset dominance. You write the algorithm to hyperfocus on the very beginning of a sound.
Just the start.
Right. The math is designed to heavily weight the interaural cues gathered during the very first millisecond of a sound's onset. After that first millisecond, the algorithm intentionally suppresses or deweights the ongoing spatial cues that follow because it mathematically assumes those ongoing cues are corrupted by room reverberation.
So it takes a snapshot of the first millisecond, locks in the location, and then stops listening for location data.
Essentially, yes. But there is another, more active approach that I find deeply fascinating. It's a model proposed by Brash and Blauert, and it relies on a process called autocorrelation.
Autocorrelation.
Yeah.
That sounds like the algorithm is talking to itself.
In a way, it is mathematically analyzing its own history. The algorithm constantly compares the incoming signal against what it heard a few milliseconds ago. It analyzes the left and right ear signals to identify repeating patterns.
Okay, to find the echo.
Right. By doing this, it calculates the exact time delay and the amplitude ratio between the direct sound and the early specular reflections bouncing off the walls.
It figures out the exact dimensions of the echo.
Yes. And once the algorithm determines the specific mathematical properties of the room's echo, it deploys adaptive deconvolution filters to essentially delete the room echo from the incoming signal entirely. It actively subtracts the reverberation, leaving a clean, dry signal for the localization algorithm to process.
Active deletion. That is incredibly smart. But I want to pivot to a scenario that always confused me. We've talked exclusively about sounds coming from the left or the right. What happens if a sound is perfectly in front of me, perfectly behind me, or perfectly above me? The median plane.
Ah, the median plane.
In that scenario, the sound hits my left ear and my right ear at the exact same millisecond, with the exact same volume. There are zero interaural differences. How does my brain or an algorithm know if a buzzing mosquito is directly above my head or directly in front of my nose?
This is one of the most difficult problems in auditory modeling. When interaural cues drop to zero, the system must rely entirely on monaural cues. Even though you are using two ears, the localization data has to be extracted by analyzing the signal in each ear individually rather than comparing them. And this is where we return to the physical shape of the outer ear, the pinna.
The cartilage folds.
Yes. The pinna acts as a highly specific, direction-dependent spectral filter. If a sound comes from directly above you, the sound waves interact with the ridges and valleys of your ear cartilage in a very specific way before entering the ear canal.
Okay.
The cartilage absorbs certain high frequencies and reflects others, creating a unique pattern of peaks and notches in the frequency spectrum. If that exact same sound comes from directly in front of you, it hits the cartilage at a different angle, creating a completely different pattern of peaks and notches.
Well, my brain has essentially memorized the specific frequency distortions caused by the unique shape of my own ears.
Exactly. Your brain has a learned internal database of how your own ears distort sound from every possible elevation. And acoustic scientists have tried to model this mathematical process in a few different ways. An older but brilliant model by Zacharuskas and Senator proposed that the brain calculates the second-order derivative of the incoming sound's frequency spectrum to pinpoint the elevation.
Okay, calculus. Let's break that down. I know the first derivative is the slope, the rate of change. What does taking the second-order derivative of a sound actually mean in plain English?
If the first derivative is the slope of the frequency curve, the second derivative measures the rate of change of the slope itself. It is essentially measuring the sharpness of the curvature.
The sharpness.
Yes. Zacharuskas and Senator argued that the absolute volume of a frequency doesn't matter as much as the sharp transitions, the sudden, tight peaks and deep, sharp valleys created by the ear cartilage. By calculating the second derivative, the algorithm specifically highlights those sharp spectral notches, stripping away the smooth background noise, allowing it to identify the specific elevation signature.
Wow. It isolates the jaggedness of the distortion. But there's a flaw in that, isn't there? That assumes the original sound, the mosquito, had a smooth frequency curve to begin with. What if the original sound was already jagged?
You've hit on the exact limitation of that model. It struggles if the source signal is highly irregular. Because of that, modern researchers, like Baumgartner and his colleagues, moved away from pure calculus and developed probabilistic models. Baumgartner's model analyzes interspectral differences, or ISDs.
How does a probabilistic model differ?
Instead of just looking for sharp curves, the algorithm looks at the entire incoming frequency spectrum and compares it against a memorized internal template of what sound spectrums should look like when coming from different angles. It calculates the statistical probability of the sound originating from elevation A versus elevation B.
So it's not a sure thing.
No, it doesn't give a definitive mathematical absolute. It says, based on the spectral distortion, there is an 85% probability the sound is coming from above and a 15% probability it is coming from behind.
It's just wild to me that every time I casually swat a mosquito buzzing over my head, my subconscious brain is instantly performing second-order derivatives and statistical probability matching based on the millimeter-specific shape of my ear cartilage.
It is a profound biological marvel. And frankly, modeling room reflections and median plane elevation remains one of the ultimate unconquered challenges in communication acoustics.
I believe it.
Think about the computational power required. A human being can walk into a massive stone cathedral entirely blindfolded, clap their hands a single time, and instantly, intuitively know the immense size of the room, the height of the ceiling, and the physical materials of the walls just by processing the subtle, complex decay of the echoes and the spectral filtering of their pinnae. Machines still profoundly struggle to not just get confused by those reflections, let alone analyze them for complex spatial awareness.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time solving where a sound is.
Yeah.
Localization. But the source material explicitly states that there is another massive piece of the puzzle that requires a completely different approach. We have to solve how to detect a hidden sound in a noisy room.
Yes, detection.
We are back to the cocktail party effect. And the textbooks say this requires a completely different type of algorithm altogether. Why can't we just use the localization math we just talked about?
Because the mathematical goal is entirely inverted. This is a fundamental shift in processing philosophy. Localization finding, where a sound is in space, is largely about finding mathematical similarities between the signals in the two ears. We call this excitatory or EE interaction.
Right, matching them up.
You are looking for the peaks of the left wave to match up with the peaks of the right wave in a cross-correlation function. You want them to agree. But detection finding, a hidden signal buried in a wall of noise, is entirely about finding mathematical dissimilarities. This relies on excitatory-inhibitory or EI interaction.
Finding the differences to find the signal. I conceptually understand that, but how does the algorithm actually execute that mathematically?
The foundational mathematical framework for this was introduced by a researcher named Durlach in the 1960s, and it is famously known as the EC theory. That stands for equalization and cancellation. It is an incredibly elegant two-step mathematical process.
Let's walk through the steps. Step 1 is equalization.
Right. Imagine a loud, masking background noise hitting both ears. The algorithm looks at the noise signal arriving at the left ear and the right ear. Step 1, equalization, requires the algorithm to internally adjust the volume, amplitude, and the timing phase of the noise in one ear until it perfectly aligns with the noise in the other ear.
Okay, so it manipulates the incoming data so that the background noise is mathematically identical on both sides. Then what?
Step 2, cancellation. The algorithm literally subtracts the left ear signal from the right ear signal. Because the background noise has just been perfectly equalized, subtracting them zeroes the noise out entirely. It mathematically cancels it to zero.
Right, because it's identical.
Exactly. However, because the hidden target signal, say your friend's voice was coming from a slightly different physical angle than the center of the noise, its phase and volume were not equalized during step 1.
Oh, so when the subtraction happens, the noise zeroes out, but the target signal doesn't.
Exactly. When the subtraction occurs, the target signal is left behind as a mathematically distinct remainder. It is completely exposed, pulled entirely out of the noise floor.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that our biological brains invented the exact concept of active noise-canceling headphones millions of years before tech companies did, and now tech companies are just writing code to mimic what the brainstem is doing natively?
That is precisely what I am saying. The phase cancellation math happening inside premium consumer headphones today is conceptually identical to the biological process Durlach was modeling in the 1960s.
That is unbelievable. But there
There
has
you
to
go.
be a catch. The brain isn't a perfect digital computer. An algorithm can perfectly subtract one float value from another, but wet biology has glitches.
Yes, and Durlach was acutely aware of that. If he ran his EC model purely mathematically, it performed significantly better than human beings actually do in listening tests. The pure math was too perfect.
So how did he fix it?
To make his model accurately predict actual human hearing data, Durlak had to intentionally program mathematical errors into his algorithms. He called this internal noise. Biological systems are squishy, jittery, and imperfect. Nerves misfire, blood flow creates static.
What kind of errors are we talking about? Like, what did he program?
He specifically added a random amplitude error variance of 0.25 and a random timing error of roughly 105 microseconds. This constant bubbling internal noise is the biological ceiling that limits human hearing. If we didn't have that internal biological jitter corrupting the signal, our ability to hear a whisper across a crowded room or detect a predator in a roaring windstorm would be virtually limitless. The math is perfect, the meat is flawed.
Wow. We have this pristine equation, but we have to rough it up to make it human. Now, Durlak's model was from the 60s. The sources indicate that things have evolved drastically since then.
They have. In 1974, researchers Colburn and Durlak published a paper laying out 5 strict rules that any true comprehensive binaural model had to meet to be taken seriously by the scientific community. They demanded that models describe the acoustic waveforms quantitatively, that they rigorously match the actual physiological data of neurons, and crucially, that they avoid having too many free parameters that just allow the programmer to artificially curve fit the data to get the result they want.
They demanded rigorous scientific integrity, not just clever coding. Do modern models meet those criteria?
Yes. Modern signal processing models, like the comprehensive frameworks developed by Breitbart and his colleagues, finally meet these strict criteria. They are incredibly complex.
What do they include?
They incorporate simulated auditory filter subbands that mimic the exact tonotopic frequency mapping of the cochlea. They include temporal integration modules that mathematically mimic the sluggishness and refractory periods of the auditory nerves, and they incorporate a vital concept called compressive nonlinearity.
Compressive nonlinearity. Let's unpack that because it sounds like dense engineering jargon. What does it mean for a sound to be linear versus nonlinear?
In a purely linear system, if you increase the physical input energy by 1 unit, the perceived output volume increases by exactly 1 unit. It is a straight, proportional line. If human hearing were linear, the quietest sounds would be imperceptible, and the loudest sounds would instantly shatter our eardrums.
So what does compressive nonlinearity do?
It means the biological system dynamically changes its sensitivity based on the volume.
So it's like an automatic volume knob.
Very much so.
Yeah.
At highly intense, loud volumes, the physical mechanics of the inner ear become very stiff. You can pump a massive amount of physical acoustic energy into the ear, but the perceived volume only increases a tiny bit. It dynamically compresses the loud sounds to protect the delicate hair cells from damage.
And for quiet sounds?
At very low, whisper-quiet volumes, the system is hypersensitive. A tiny microscopic increase in physical acoustic energy results in a massive boost in perceived volume, ensuring we don't miss the sound of a twig snapping in the distance. Breitbart's mathematical models actually simulate this dynamic biological compression in the code, which is why they predict human performance so accurately.
I'm stuck on the math of the cancellation part, the EC theory. If my brain is doing this equalization and cancellation, does it need to know what the background noise sounds like ahead of time to cancel it? Like, do I need to stand in the restaurant for a minute to learn the noise before I can tune it out?
You've just hit on what was once a massive contentious debate in psychoacoustics. Earlier theories heavily assumed that the brain required a priori knowledge, meaning the system needed a few seconds to learn the statistical properties of the noise before it could calculate the equalization and tune it out.
But that doesn't feel right. I can tune things out pretty instantly.
And you are correct. Later dynamic experiments, which fed rapidly changing, unpredictable bursts of noise into headphones, definitively proved that humans can cancel highly unpredictable, wildly fluctuating noise on the fly practically instantly.
Without learning it first.
Yes. We do this across multiple different frequency bands simultaneously. There is virtually no analyzer sluggishness. Your brain is independently applying different optimal cancellation strategies to the low frequencies, the mid frequencies, and the high frequencies in real time as the noise environment shifts around you.
Our subconscious is just flexing unparalleled processing power on us every single second. Okay, so we have all this brilliant math, we have the biological insights, we have the history from Lord Rayleigh to Durlak to Breitbart, but the source material asks a really grounded, practical question. What is the ultimate goal here?
The application.
Right. All of this theoretical knowledge is somewhat useless if it just sits locked away in an academic textbook. How is this actually being used to change the technology we interact with every single day?
Well, the collaborative AABBA group, which, if you recall, is that massive network of top research labs we are drawing this data from, identified four generic, highly practical application areas where these models are actively changing the world right now.
Let's go through them. What is the first?
First is spatial scanning and mapping. This involves deploying algorithms into physical spaces to analyze complex room acoustics, design better concert halls, or create flawless audio maps for virtual reality environments.
Okay, scanning rooms. Second.
Second is signal level representation. This is arguably the most impactful for daily life. This involves the massive algorithms used in modern audio coding, like how streaming services compress audio without losing spatial quality, and the monumental advancements in modern digital hearing aids.
Getting the exact right volume to the exact right ear at the exact right microsecond to help someone isolate a voice.
Exactly. Hearing aids are no longer just amplifiers, they are dynamic binaural signal processors. The third area is symbolic representation. This is the frontier of AI. This is teaching an artificial intelligence not just to assign a location to a sound, but to assign semantic meaning to the audio map.
What's the difference there?
It's the difference between a self-driving car knowing a sound is at 45 degrees left versus knowing a siren is rapidly approaching from the front left intersection.
Ah, okay. The context and the fourth area.
Fourth is quality evaluation. This uses these mathematical models to test the immersion of a new virtual reality headset or the spatial clarity of a new surround sound theater system without needing to hire and run hundreds of human test subjects. The algorithm can definitively tell you human ears will perceive a spatial blur of 3 degrees on the speaker system.
But the text points out a massive historical hurdle in acoustic science that held all of this back for decades. It's the problem of reinventing the wheel.
It has been a severe plague on the discipline of computational science. Historically, if a brilliant graduate student wanted to add a new feature to an existing localization model, say, they wanted to add a new compressive nonlinearity module to Durlac's old code, they might spend 6 months to a year just trying to rebuild the original model from the raw math published in an old journal.
Just to get to the starting line.
Exactly. And they also failed because the original code or the exact parameters were never shared by the original authors.
Which leads to a quote from Buckheit and Donahoe that I absolutely love.
Yeah.
It completely shifted how I view scientific literature. Let me read it. An article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment.
It's a powerful, almost aggressive indictment of closed-door proprietary science.
Right. The paper is just the movie trailer. The actual executable code is the movie. You can't critically review a movie by only watching the trailer. If you publish the math but hide the code, you aren't doing science, you're doing marketing.
And that profound philosophy is the absolute driving force behind the AM toolbox, the auditory modeling toolbox. The ABBA group and other leading researchers finally recognized that holding on to proprietary code was stalling human progress.
So what did they do?
They created a freely available open source collection of these auditory models. By openly sharing the raw algorithms, the executable code, and the testing parameters, researchers no longer have to spend a year reinventing the wheel. They can instantly download Brebart's model, run it, and immediately begin building upon decades of rigorous scientific work.
It accelerates the entire field.
Drastically. This open source collaboration is exactly how we are getting rapidly better hearing aids, flawless stereophonic reproduction, and deeply immersive virtual oral environments. It is the democratization of acoustic science.
It is just so incredible to step back and look at the whole picture. We have gone from the physical, mechanical vibration of a tiny stirrup bone in the middle ear, fighting impedance mismatch, all the way to the dense calculus of the EC theory, and finally to open source code repositories that are actively changing how machines listen to the world.
It's quite a journey.
I want you, the listener, to remember this the next time you're walking in the woods and you effortlessly, casually turn your head because you heard a tiny twig snap behind you. In that fraction of a second, your subconscious brain executed millions of calculations, analyzing phase locks, calculating probabilities of elevation, heavily weighting centroids, and actively filtering out the echoes of the trees. It is a breathtaking biological process that the world's smartest engineers have spent a century desperately trying to replicate in cold silicon.
And looking at that silicon leaves us with a fascinating and perhaps slightly unsettling philosophical thought to mull over. We discussed earlier that Durlach had to intentionally program internal noise, amplitude errors, and biological microsecond delays into his pure algorithms to make them accurately mimic human detection.
Right, the math was too perfect.
So if our ultimate engineering goal in the next decade is to create perfect, indistinguishable virtual reality environments, digital worlds that our brains accept as absolutely real, will software engineers have to intentionally program biological flaws, stutters, and mathematical errors into the audio engine.
Oh, wow.
If the machine's acoustic rendering is too pristine, too mathematically flawless, will our brains reject it? Will perfect sound actually trigger an auditory uncanny valley, where the absolute perfection of the simulation makes us feel completely horrifyingly disconnected from reality?
If the physics are too perfect, our wet, squishy brains will instantly know it's fake. We require the noise to feel at home. That is a wild, profound thought to end on. Well, do yourself a favor today. Take off your headphones, just sit and listen to the room you are in, and take a moment to appreciate the miraculous, impossibly complex, perfectly flawed dual microphone supercomputer strapped to the sides of your head.